Well, listen, what we really emphasize here is that you need to have a stable base load of power. Otherwise, you'll never be able to get really rich. We know this, and we're actually seeing the opposite problem in England and many other places because they've been so concerned about going green, they've forgotten to say you need a base load. You can't control solar or wind. You can control, to a certain extent, biomass. But what you need is a stable base load. I also heard Muma referencing China before. Let's just remember, China has a tiny bit, about 0.01% of its energy that comes from wind, and it keeps expanding its coal, especially its coal usage, dramatically. And that fundamentally underpins the point of saying, until we have cheap green energy, you're never going to get people to switch over, and you shouldn't, because then you end up with roving blackouts.
Muna happens to think that if we engineer or orchestrate a change in the entire system of the economy, that would basically make all jobs green, essentially. Bjorn?
Well, and listen, that would be a wonderful endpoint. I would agree with the goal and the vision, but certainly with the way that it's been done most places in the world, and I would also assume many proponents in South Africa, it's about doing it too soon while it's still pretty expensive. And that's a bad decision because you end up spending lots of money, creating few jobs, and creating very ineffective and very expensive energy, whereas you could have spent that money on getting more energy access, getting cheaper energy that would actually make more productivity, and of course focusing on getting innovation into green energy so that they become cheap enough. When they're cheap enough, there's no contention. Of course we should go to green, but when they're not cheap enough, we got to ask ourselves, is it worth our while to spend subsidy dollars or subsidy rands on that, rather than focusing on the very immediate problems that South Africa and everyone else has?
Well, Muna, let's ask you this. If we look at a very simple effort that the government is putting in of introducing solar water geysers, I mean, initially that would create a good number of jobs, but in the long term, in the maintenance that's required and so forth, it doesn't require pulling coal out of the ground, transporting it, having someone physically shovel it. So where exactly, how sustainable is the job creation in that sort of context?
Well, I think as a broader context, firstly, it's very interesting to hear the establishment, certainly in South Africa, speak about concern of job losses by being greener. I didn't hear much from them when we lost 500,000 jobs a couple of years ago. So, you know, in the normal course of business, when we have job losses, we don't hear these voices. But when we speak about challenging the vested interests and putting into place a sustainable economy, suddenly job losses becomes an issue. Secondly, I'd like to just clarify and build on something that Bjorn said. The fact that solar power and wind power are intermittent, they might not run 24/7, but they're highly predictable. And there's really good research that shows that, for example, a distributed generation network with wind is highly predictable and can indeed produce baseload. And let's not forget things like solar thermal chimneys, tidal rates, wave power. You know, there's a long list, OTEC. These are technologies that run 24/7 and don't have the pollutive impacts. But if you look at the life cycle from day one till day end, so for example, South Africa is considering massively increasing nuclear power, which of course people like myself vehemently object to. If you take into account the life cycle, the mining, the health impact, the environmental impact, the milling, enrichment of the fuel, the use of it, the emissions of cesium, strontium, iodine, and then the massive decommissioning costs, and then the hundreds of thousands of years of waste management. Those kinds of costs are so high you can't even quantify them. So the reality is we need to apply honest accounting, full life cycle analysis, and genuinely work out what it's costing the economy. And in that case, hands down, the renewable and sustainable energies and options win.
Bjorn, Muna makes a very good point there. I mean, you've previously raised this issue of costs yourself, saying these heavy subsidies are needed to get the green economy going. Yet we've seen massive trillion-dollar injections into failed aspects of manufacturing, as it happened in the recession in the United States. Now, isn't this something our leaders should just bite the bullet and do because it's necessary?
Well, listen, Muma is going to get no disposition from me from saying, you know, for instance, nuclear is probably more costly than fossil fuels. And so definitely nuclear is a separate issue. But the real point here is we should definitely make the accountant honest absolutely, and that's what academics like me and many others, and I'm sure Muma and his people are also trying to do this. But certainly if we look at the green economy as it's been most developed in Europe, it turns out that we end up spending very large sums on subsidies on getting very little energy. And that's really the bottom line, to say, all right, if we're going to spend lots of money and getting very little carbon cuts, that we could have gotten much cheaper elsewhere, and that we end up producing less energy, which is fundamentally the thing that grows an economy, we've got to ask ourselves whether we did the right thing. So this is not about the end point. This is about saying, should we buy a lot of very expensive energy now, or should we be focusing much more on innovation, that is, get cheap green energy available so that everyone wants to buy it, rather than we having to pump lots of billions of rands or dollars into making this happen. In my home country, Denmark, we have put up lots and lots of windmills. We felt very proud about them, but it actually turns out that, first of all, they are a problem because they're intermittent. And yes, you can deal with some of it, but you can't deal with all of it. And fundamentally, what we've done is pay a lot of money, and we've got very little CO2 reduction. And now, of course, we've cut down all these windmills because they're hugely inefficient, and put up more efficient, they're still not efficient, but more efficient ones. Let's not make the same mistake in South Africa. Focus on making smart decisions, that is, invest when the green energy is sufficiently cheap, but not before.
And let me put this question to you, Bjorn, before you go. Clearly, there are some factors here that mitigate against us rushing out and doing this blindly. But if this is a choice we have to make due to the reality of global warming, what is the way we can mitigate the effects of job losses, as you believe, in a country like South Africa?
Well, what you have to realize, we did a report on the claims of green jobs, and actually what we found was, if you're concerned about job losses, if you're concerned about spending public money, either through investment in green energy or otherwise, there are much better ways that you can get jobs. We know that for every $1 million you spend on solar or wind, you probably create somewhere between 3 and 7 jobs. For every $1 million you spend in construction or in transportation and healthcare, you can create somewhere between 15 and 25 jobs. So if you want to create jobs, there are much more effective ways to do that short term. Now, with regards to global warming, we need to deal with global warming, but let's not kid ourselves and believe that we're going to manage this by cutting a little bit right now. Remember, even if we look at the International Energy Agency, the OECD for energy, their best scenario by 2035, we will still just have 1.7% of energy that comes from wind and solar in the world. So this is not a question about rushing out right now. This is about making sure that we make the innovation into those technologies so that not just well-meaning people buy a few of them, but that everyone will end up buying all of them. So this is about getting to the green economy, not by subsidizing now, but by making smart investments so that it eventually will be competitive for everyone.
Bjorn Lomborg, we are going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us your insight into this particular story. We're going to move to Cape Town to Muna. Muna, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to what Bjorn said, that it simply isn't wise to just rush into this. This should be more carefully considered than indeed it has been so far. How do you feel?
Well, he's partially correct in saying that we shouldn't be focusing only on green energy. And that seems to be sort of, the sexy topic of the day, because we see it as being linked to climate change. But it is indeed the entire economy that's responsible for emissions. And while our largest portion of emissions might come from fossil fuels in South Africa, I think we need to unpack what we use this energy for. So we have a situation where 50 million South Africans are using less than 20% of our electricity, but we have the energy intensive user group, which is 36 companies.
Yes, I can hear you.
Using 40%
Thank you very much. I'm glad we make it work.
Electricity.
All right,
so,
take good care.
I think the way the production side of our economy is structured requires a serious look. The other thing I think we need to look at as well is the continually upward trend in fossil fuels, be it oil or coal. We're looking at coal prices maybe not changing so much, but certainly the quality will be poorer and poorer. We've seen the shocks from imported oil that we've felt in our country. And of course, there's now some insane projects on the go, like drilling literally hundreds of thousands of holes in the Karoo to frack gas out, and for the lifetime, certainly for a few generations, impact negatively on our water supply. So we really need to keep fracking out, keep fossil fuels out. but we need to move the economy using our current energy consumption to a sustainable one. So for example, the quickest return on investment for energy is actually energy efficiency. It creates the highest numbers of jobs per megawatt saved, which avoids a megawatt generated. We call them negawatts, as in negative watts. And really, it's something we can do in the short term with our current skill set. We have hundreds of thousands of people in the manufacturing.
We are going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry to have to cut you off, but you've certainly made your point very, very clearly in our program this afternoon, and I thank you very much for joining us.